Hello, general music teacher friends. Welcome to session number 3 of webinar number 5. We're going to take that data and talk about how to create centers and groups for learning. So let's get into it. So let's review that performance standard number 6 of our Teacher Keys effectiveness system and look at assessment uses. We're going to use that assessment to inform instructional content and delivery methods. Remember, that's the part we're focusing on. And you will have time to provide timely feedback and constructive feedback for your students. So let's focus in on how we can inform our instructional content and our delivery methods. And our learning target for this session is to learn how to interpret that data and create learning centers for our students. Maybe you've already worked with centers. Maybe they're a large part of your teaching methods and strategies. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between what is differentiation, what is a center, and maybe what is a group, just to get some vocabulary in our minds as we continue this session. So centers host an activity for student-led learning. So if you create a center where students perform on boom whackers, for example, the teacher won't lead that. The students would lead that. They would follow the directions on their own, count each other off so they can perform together, remind each other about notes of the song, help each other out. Totally student-led activity. Groups work a little bit differently in my mind. I believe groups can serve as a student-led or a teacher-led learning activity. And of course, as we look at the term differentiation, we know that that delivers learning, the activity, or the practice with a different strategy for those students. For example, if when teaching students a particular rhythm, I was standing in front of the board and projecting on the board those rhythms, and we were performing on body percussion, if I wanted to differentiate that strategy, I would do that in a center where students might use syllables or perform on different instruments rather than body percussion, a different method of delivering and a different method of practice. So now that we have a group of collected data, now we'll talk about how to use that data, whether it's the item analysis or whether it's the rubric. So let's talk about what to do when we finally have some data. In this case, I'm going to refer back to the data that we saw in our second session, which was on identifying 16th notes, triplets, and meter. Specifically, after looking at that data, I knew that I needed to reteach the identification of triplets and as well the the identification of meter. And 16ths weren't quite as bad as triplets, but they were close. So in this case, I used that data to say I need to remediate and refine. I decided I wasn't quite ready to enrich learning yet necessarily as a specific target, but in this case, I wanted to focus now to remediate and refine 16th note and triplet identification and performance. I got to decide how many groups are necessary. Well, a typical number is 3 student groups. That usually works out with most sizes, but in some cases, you may need to have 4 student groups, or sometimes maybe depending on your data and how your data rolled out, maybe there was just 2 student groups that you specifically needed, and you needed to reteach one and refine the other. You can have 3 student groups. You can have 2 student groups and 1 teacher group, or 2 student groups, as we just mentioned. I will talk more specifically about the teacher group in just one moment. And how will you group your students so that they can visit your centers, or you'll teach them one-on-one in that group? How will you do that? You can do that by ability. That's where we looked at those questions, those 3 or 4 questions, and kind of saw where the students fell on those questions and decided, how the students performed on those questions, and decided that we would group them with a group that met the standard, and a group that didn't meet, and a group that needed reteaching altogether. So in the level 4 rubric, that was the 3, 2, and 1 level. We had just 1 or 2 students that fell in the level 4. So that would be ability grouping. You could also use the mixed ability grouping. That's where, let's say, we've divided the students into or aligned their scores. So we've listed from the highest score on those questions to the lowest, or on that quiz to from highest to lowest. And now we're going to put them into maybe two groups. So we would group a higher performer student with a student that's on the middle. So if the numbers were 1 to 16, student number 1 would go with student number 9, student number 2 with student number 10, and so forth, so that the ability levels would be um, mixed, not the same common score across the assessment. I want to make a note and pause just to remind you that you know what works best for your students. You've been teaching many of those students since kindergarten. And in middle school, some of you have seen those students for 3, 4 semesters sometimes. So now you already know those students, and you know what type of groups that you need, and you know which students work best with other students. So when developing your groupings, whether it's ability or mixed ability, make sure that you certainly take in consideration your student group and how they respond to different strategies, and how they respond to collaborating and working together, and use that to your advantage, so that you plan ahead for those foreseeable obstacles. Now let's actually talk about some different strategies or activities for differentiation. So this is for a ability or mixed ability grouping. And we've taken those three groups that we've talked about. So I have a group of students that finished in the higher 3, 4 on those questions. They had a good grasp of them. I have a group of students that finished in the middle, and a group of students that finished in the lower percentile. So what I've placed those in the groups. Now I'm going to choose three differentiated strategies for students to refine their knowledge and to remediate. So, for example, group number 1 is where they will start, or if you're doing rotating centers, and let me pause, I missed that on my slide. These groups could be rotating in 15-minute or 12-minute segments. Consider that when you're planning if you want them to rotate. They certainly don't have to rotate, but certainly that much time in your class in one center, you would want to make sure that the students have a lot to do so that they don't lose interest in that. So group 1, I said, let's do popsicle rhythms. I call them popsicles because you're familiar with them. You write them on the end of popsicle sticks, drop them down in the cup, and then students pull one out, right? So you would put the rhythm side down in the cup. Now you can write on the popsicle sticks. Some teachers I've seen tape them. There's lots of different ways to do that, but obviously students would be grabbing or taking a rhythm they haven't seen, putting in front of them and performing it. You could have that group where everybody performs the same one, or they're working in partners, which is a great way for students to learn. So group 2 would be putting those sixteenths and triplets into measures, and that's where I would refine their understanding of that 3, 4 meter that they needed a little bit of help with. And then finally, group 3 would be the create and perform. This helps us really understand, not only can they identify the 16th note, can they say the syllables that go with the 16th note and the triplets? Can they do that while they're performing? So those would be the three groups. You would decide, are these groups going to rotate? If your classes meet for 45 minutes or 50 minutes, you probably have enough time for them to rotate for 12 minutes each, approximately, giving yourself a little buffer time. If your schedule is a little bit shorter, then just consider what the students are going to do in the activity so that you can plan for really good timing, and that you don't get caught up in the logistics and don't have a good experience for those students. We'll talk about that in one moment about timing. So this is one way, one strategy with three different delivery methods. Notice they're performing, which is kinesthetic. They're also using cognitive to figure out if those rhythms will fit into those 3, 4 measures. And of course, creating is our higher level of thinking, where the students are creating their own rhythms. So that is an example of how you could use three different centers or three different groupings for your students to have differentiated instruction using the data that you collected. Hence, our data is driving our instruction. This example is for mixed ability grouping with a teacher reteach group. So these students are mixed ability. They're not all the same. And so when I mix them up, I'm going to mix them up so that when I have a teacher led group, that I kind of have a student that has a grasp, maybe a level three performer of that standard, matched with a level two or level one. So the reason for that is that they can help them as I continue to extend the learning. And so I will have a teacher led group, and then I'll have a group where we're putting those 16ths into measures, and a group where they're creating and performing. Now, the second group is going to be mixed ability with some of the lower level and the higher level. And then group three is going to be a majority of those students in the middle that might have fallen a little bit below, but for the most part, we're on the 3 and 2 level. So I'd mix those abilities together, and I would have that in every group. Now, in group one is the teacher led group. That's where I would make sure that all the students that perform the lowest, I'm going to reteach them that triplet 16th note. And you might say, well, why are we mixing the ability there? If you mix that ability when I get up to move around to monitor group two or group three, that's when I turn that student led or that teacher led group for a brief period of time into a student led group where they're working with each other in their pairs, and I get to monitor and redirect or answer questions briefly for the other students. Now, in this session, I might rotate group two and three depending on how much remediation the students need in the data. In this situation, I would monitor for that meter group to see if they had a good grasp of placing those rhythms into the 3/4 meter. And if they did, I would say, okay, now we're going to switch group two and three, and I would go back to group one. Lots of flexibility there. Again, you know your students, you know how well they collaborate, you know what activities are going to work, and you know how much flexibility you would have. Certainly, if you were to do common ability or same ability grouping, then you would have that teacher group again where you would have those students that didn't meet those standards. And then group three would be the students that met the standards. Group two would be students that needed remediation. Then you could work with those students. You would just have a little bit less flexibility in your ability and your freedom to get up and kind of check on other students. You could still do it depending on your room, but it might be you might have more flexibility when you do the mixed ability grouping. So you will know what works best for you. You're the expert on your students and the expert in your classroom. So once you figure out how that works best for you, it'll work super well for you and for your students. So we led you through collecting some data and interpreting that data, and how to create some centers, and talked a little bit about differentiation. So now let me give you some tips for those of you that are implementing or trying to uh, refine or extend your implementation of differentiated centers in your music classroom. My first tip is timing, timing, timing. Um, if you have a 45-minute classroom, you won't probably be able to do three 45-minute rotations, right? That would be nice and perfect, but we know sometimes classes don't arrive on time, and we always need that buffer of time to tell students what to do, which leads me to my second tip. The first implementation takes longer. So I'd encourage you to maybe plan for just a 10-minute rotation with a wrap up, because you're going to need about 5 to 7 minutes to explain each center, get the students in the right center, and make sure that everybody knows what to do. So that's pretty important for you to know, and to allow yourself a little grace and mercy if this is your first time. If you're trying to try something different in a center, you have to be flexible and know that it's not going to work the first time. Usually, it doesn't work the first time perfectly. There's some small glitch. So just remember to allow yourself to flex in the middle of the moment and change things up if you need to. Students will go right with you as long as you explain to them the why, and show them the new way or how you're going to fix the issue. The third thing is consider sound when you're planning your centers. If you're going to have students playing instruments, then remember that playing instruments in all three centers is not necessarily differentiated unless it's the same thing on different instruments. However, what are you going to be able to hear? Will the students be able to hear themselves? So consider that when you maybe plan one center that's playing and performing on instruments or loud, maybe if another group has to perform as well, maybe theirs is on a soft floor with their hands, body percussion, or with some rhythm sticks that are a little bit quieter. And maybe if you have technology in a classroom, consider a connecting or responding activity that requires students to use headphones, which is going to give you a little bit more freedom to hear what's being played so you can provide instant feedback and move easily between the groups. Be creative is my next tip. Work with what you have. We're all in different music classrooms. We all have different resources. Sometimes our classes are different times. Sometimes they're the same. Sometimes we see them a lot, sometimes a little. So you have to make sure that you are creative with what you have, work with the instruments that you have and the space that you have and the materials that you have. But I've found that music teachers, regardless of the grades, are usually pretty creative people. So be creative and resourceful when you plan your centers and your activities. Important is demonstration or assessment. How will you follow up? How will you show growth? You know, you collected this data and now we've remediated, refined, and enriched learning about 16th notes and triplets. How am I going to follow up with that? How will I show that students have given growth or have shown growth? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is to go back and revisit that assessment that you already gave those few questions, give those same questions again after you've taught them, or allow students to perform and demonstrate for you as a teacher, or allow them to perform and demonstrate for the class. Next tip for you is to remember that our standards are to perform, create, respond, and connect. So as you plan for your centers, remember to align them with the specific standard and allow students to perform using that standard, or create something, or respond to a performance, or to connect to something musically to another content area, or to something in their community, or something specific in their life. And remember the last tip, student-led learning, teacher facilitator. If you're doing differentiated centers or discovery centers where students are doing different things, remember the goal is to let that be student-led. If you need to assign roles for students, where one is the conductor, one is the counter offer, or if somebody is in charge of the equipment or the materials, making sure they get put back, give those students names and titles and let them help you as you facilitate their learning as it's student-led. So hopefully I've provided some comments that are helpful to you, and some ideas and some how-to with data and differentiation that's practical and easy to implement. Really excited about our next webinar. Let's talk about it. We're going to have some conversations with some elementary and middle school music experts. I look forward to talking to you and being with you then. I'll see you soon. Please visit our discussion post and share with us about your data and differentiation. I'd love to hear about some of your centers. We'll see you in our next webinar.